presentation is done by Bianca Peeters. And the subject is Stephenson, Point Loma Theosophy in Japan. For me, an almost unknown subject. Only learned a few years ago that there were some activities over there, so we are really anxious to see what was there happening. Bianca.
So this lecture is made by Yoshinaga Shin'ichi, if I pronounce that right, and it goes as follows. Theosophy was first introduced to Japan around the 1880s. Olcott's first visit to Japan caused a great sensation and is regarded as a catalyst for Buddhist revival in Japan. But it cannot be said that Theosophy became well known in Japan after Olcott's journey to Japan. It can be understood easily if you know... Yeah. Whoop.
Just hold a moment.
Yeah.
Would you mind beginning again?
No problem. So we start over. Theosophy was first introduced to Japan in the 1880s. Olcott's visit to Japan caused a great sensation and is regarded as a catalyst for Buddhist revival in Japan. But it cannot be said that Theosophy became well known in Japan after Olcott's journey to Japan. It can be understood easily if you know how the translation of Theosophy has changed. Theosophy was first translated as Shin'ichi in the 1920s and then translated as Reikikaku till the middle of the 20th century and again changed into Shinkikaku. This tradition of the term itself indicates that there seems little consistency in the history of Theosophy in Japan. It was only toward the end of the 1970s that Theosophical ideas became known to some degree. In the 1980s and 90s, they have spread through popular books and magazines about Western occultism, through New Age practices like channeling, through anthroposophy of Rudolf Steiner, whose educational system has become popular, and new religious movements like Kofuku no Karaku or Aum Shinrikyo. How far or how deep Theosophical ideas have influenced Japanese religious or spiritual culture is beyond the scope of this lecture. It is safe to say Japanese people did not import Theosophy as a system, but in their rudimentary forms. Still, Theosophy has played one role after another in the history of Japanese modern religions. We don't need to exaggerate or to underestimate it if we want to see Theosophy as it was in Japan. Before 1945, there had been 3 periods when Theosophy gained popularity to some extent. The first was from 1887 to around 1900. In 1889, Henry S. Olcott visited Japan for the first time. Olcott made speeches around Japan, which attracted a lot of people who had been dissatisfied with the westernization and the Christian missions. His visit was an instant success. Adding to this, there were published a lot of Theosophical articles on the Buddhist journals. Though Japanese Buddhists were at loss whether to classify him as a Mahayana Buddhist or a Theravada Buddhist, they thought of him as a Buddhist, and some called Theosophy Buddhism in Europe and America. Olcott was only a part of the Westerners' growing interests in Buddhism. After the success of the Light of Asia, Buddhism was gradually known to the people who were dissatisfied with Christianity. Around the mid-1890s, young intellectuals who were of the first generation brought up in the westernized educational system suffered from existential distress. They became free from the ethos of the feudal ages, but found no ground by which to live as a citizen of the newly built nation of Japan. They needed new religions to believe. It is interesting to note that one of these young intellectuals, D.T. Suzuki, published his first book titled On New Religion in 1896. His friend and a progressive reformer of Buddhism, Furukawa Rosen, proposed to study Tibetan Buddhism, to borrow mystical methods from it, to revitalize the religious experiences gained in Japanese Buddhism, like Theosophy did. But many of them preferred Unitarianism to Theosophy as an answer to their distress, as the former presented the more rational worldview and the more social-oriented morals, which better satisfied the spiritual needs of the younger generations. The Theosophical Society had at least one lodge opened during this period. Hirai Kinza, who was a teacher of English and a Buddhist activist, opened a lodge in Kyoto in 1887 and organized the committee to invite Olcott to Japan. This lodge published the translation of Olcott's Golden Rules of Buddhism. Hirai's committee succeeded in inviting Olcott, but the lodge seems to stop its activity after that. Hirai traveled to America in 1892 to propagate Mahayana Buddhism. Hirai made a moving speech at the Parliament of the World's Religions in 1893 and became famous as a lecturer of Buddhism. At the Parliament, he made friends with Jenkin Lloyd Jones, an uncle of Frank Lloyd Wright, and a liberal Unitarian priest in Chicago. Hirai and Jones agreed on their opinion on liberal religion. Hirai might have been influenced by the socialistic type of Christian theology. Of course, Theosophy had a socialistic inclination in it in the 19th century. Hirai must have known the socialism of Theosophy, but he was attracted by the Unitarianism because there were some young Buddhists who had already chosen it in Japan. He followed his Buddhist friend and took part in Unitarianism after he came back to Japan in 1894. The second wave of Theosophy was from 1910 to the 1920s, when E.S. Stephenson opened a Theosophical lodge, and after that, Beatrice Suzuki opened another lodge. From 1910 to 1926, there was a boom of spiritualism being published. This was partly due to the global trend from material to spiritual thoughts, which had been prophesied by the pioneers in the 19th century, like H.P.B., which had risen around the turn of the century and would become clear between the world wars. This global trend seemed to be a revival of superstitions to some rationalists, but also an alternative way to the materialistic trend. Some of the examples which indicate this turn to spiritual were William James's book Varieties of Religious Experiences from 1902, which caused an interest in the psychology of the unconsciousness and spirituality. Oliver Lodge's spiritualistic book Survival of Man from 1909 had become a bestseller worldwide. Not only spiritualism, but also theosophy, anthroposophy, Gurdjieff, and other Eastern gurus became active in Europe and America. So-called metaphysical, and America so-called metaphysical, namely the eclectic spiritual thoughts of theosophy, spiritualism, and new thoughts began appearing in America, which influenced Japan's counterpart called Reijutsu. As for Japan, the zeitgeist had started changing before 1910. After the Russo-Japan War, people felt dissatisfied although Japan won the war. There was a big riot happening at the Hibiya Park on September 5th, 1905. Young students felt anguish in seeking for the meanings of life. Those young boys were called Hanmonseinen, which means anguished young people. And socialism spread, and gradually radical wing and moderate wing took shape. Some of the moderate socialists were at the same time Unitarians or progressive Buddhists. Hypnotism was a boom from 1903. There sprang up a lot of mesmeric practitioners, some of whom would become occult soon. One practitioner, Kuwabara Toshiro, who was a teacher at Shizuoka School for Teachers, claimed that he could control physical phenomena with his power of will. His books on hypnotism or mental therapy sold well. Mysticism also became in vogue. Anesaki Masaharu of the University of Tokyo, after returning from a 3-year study in Europe, lectured on mysticism from 1903. Tsunashima Ryosen, a literary critic and philosopher, experienced seeing God 3 times in 1904. His articles about the experience created a great sensation among intellectuals. Before 1900, spiritual had been regarded as superstition, which intellectuals should laugh about. But the zeitgeist was gradually turning from rationalistic or materialistic to spiritual or religious from 1900 to 1909. In 1910, Swedenborg's Heaven and Hell was translated by D.T. Suzuki, and The Key to Theosophy by Blavatsky was translated by Udaka, Hiyosaku, and E.S. Stephenson. In the beginning of the 20th century, the trend towards spiritual gained speed. 3 other Swedenborgian books were translated by D.T. Suzuki. Books on spiritualism were published, including Oliver Lodge, and Baha'i and Steiner's Anthroposophy were also imported. Besides, Japan's own spiritual movements arose, 2 of which seem worth mentioning. One was Reijutsu, which was the alternative healing practice. It almost corresponded to the metaphysical thought in America. Both arose from hypnotism, absorbed spiritualistic and scientific knowledge, and had connections with their traditional religious background. Reijutsu practitioners boasted of the paranormal power as well as the power of psychic healings. Usui of the Reiki healing was one of such practitioners. The other religion was Omotokyo. This is a new religious movement begun by Deiguchi Nao in 1892. It is usually classified as Shintoism, but it actually is an eclectic movement absorbing many Eastern and Western spiritual and religious teachings. In 1921, spiritual experiences and the prophecy of the world end combined. In sum, the Japan of this era saw a boom of Western spiritual thoughts, Japanese metaphysical healings, and Omotokyo and so on, in which Theosophy appeared again. Taking Stephenson aside for the later discussion, we would like to look at the theosophical activities of Beatrice Suzuki and her husband, Daisetsu Suzuki. Suzuki Daisetsu stayed in America for 10 years, during which he made friends with Albert J. Edmonds, a Swedenborgian, a Quaker, and a researcher of Buddhism. Suzuki must have had some knowledge about the Western spiritual thought, but it was his wife Beatrice that took the initiative in organizing a Mahayana lodge in Kyoto. There had been an international lodge affiliated to the TSPL in Tokyo. It was organized by James Cousins, an Irish poet and a teacher at Keio University in 1920. It consisted of foreigners and a few Japanese, including Beatrice and Daisetsu Suzuki. Beatrice and Daisetsu became members of the TS on the formation of this lodge, so their interest in theosophy was comparatively new. But this lodge began to decline the following year as the Suzukis moved to Kyoto to become teachers at the Otani University. On May 8th in 1924, Beatrice, Daisetsu, Emma Hahn, who was Beatrice's mother, two Japanese professors named Utsuki Nishu and Yisoji Tetsugai, and three other members gathered to organize a new lodge called the Mahayana Lodge in Kyoto. Utsuki and Yisoji were Buddhist priests. They had studied at the University of Southern California when they had become members of the TS through the Crotona Institute of Theosophy. Buddhist priests who studied theosophy have been very few. This lodge consisted of mainly professors of Otani University and Ryokuku University and some foreigners. Suzuki Daisetsu did not fully agree with his wife's theosophical activities. He criticized theosophy, especially his wife's involvement with the Order of the Star in the East, in his personal letters to Beatrice. Still, this lodge continued its activity, having 17 meetings from 1924 to 1929. The reason why this lodge stopped its activity was not clear. Of course, one reason is that Krishnamurti dropped out of the order, but perhaps Beatrice was always seeking one spiritual truth after another. After Krishnamurti, she became devoted to the esoteric Buddhism of the Shingon-shu sect. Just after World War II, Christmas Humphreys came to Japan as one of the legal members of the Tokyo trials. 4 of his books were translated and published from 1947 to 1957. He was the founder of London Buddhist Society and introduced the works of D.T. Suzuki to the Western world. Also, he had been a theosophist who still mentioned the name of Blavatsky in his book on Buddhism. But his influence was restricted. More influential was a writer named Miura Seikizo and his society Ryokai. The interests in the spiritual thoughts declined after World War II, all over the world. Instead, the belief in the Orthodox religion, Christianity, the existentialism, the socialism, and the scientific thinking were on the rise. It was the age after Hiroshima. In Japan, new religions prospered, but the Western spiritual thoughts did not. There were some reasons why the spiritual thoughts declined. One is that it had been associated with a nationalistic and militaristic zeal before World War II. The second reason is that Japan's losing the war was thought to be due to the neglecting scientific thinking. Science became a kind of magical word with which we could open the door to the future world. The third reason is that new religious movements like Saicho no I or Sekai Kyushi Kyo, both of which were born from Omotokyo, satisfied the spiritual yearnings in their practical and theoretical sides. The futuristic vision of science continued until Expo 1770 in Osaka. In the 1970s, Uri Geller, Erich von Däniken and Colin Wilson changed the trend. Western spiritual thoughts would be rediscovered and imported after around 1980 through the influence of the New Age. But the period from 1945 to 1970 was a winter of the Western spiritual thoughts. Miura and his society was one of the few companies which kept publishing spiritual books during this winter. Miura was a writer and translator of educational books. He translated Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Émile, which was a bestseller in the 1920s. Also, he had written some books about mysticism and occultism, since he mentioned Blavatsky as early as 1916. After World War II, he became a yoga teacher, publishing an introductory book of Yogananda's teachings in 1953. He also organized a theosophical lodge called Ryokai. His understanding of theosophy was heavily influenced by Maurice Doriel and Alice Bailey, but especially Doriel. The kind of theosophy Miura imported was full of sci-fi, like gadgets or stories and hints of the end of the world echoing the Cold War. Doriel's books and some of Miura's books digesting his teachings had been the more popular among the few books of the Western occultism in till the 1970s. After the 1980s, more books of the New Ages were translated and published, but it was their books that trod the path to the boom. Theosophy appeared first as a kind, the Western Buddhism, then as a kind of mysticism to the younger generation of Buddhists, and it was an alternative way of personal spirituality which appealed mainly to the intellectuals. Thirdly, after World War II, it was presented as a popular kind of the mixture of occult teachings like that of Doriel, which appealed to the imaginative minds enduring under the fear of the Cold War. Though theosophy as a classical form did not get rooted in Japan, but rudimentary as they were, theosophical ideas, like the idea of masters or auras, found their way into the vocabulary of Japanese religious thought. E.S. Stephenson's or Beatrice Suzuki's lodge activities were limited in their influence because they aimed at elites or intellectuals. Only English was spoken in the lodge meetings of Beatrice Suzuki's Mahayana Lodge. If we measure the significance of a spiritual thinker only by the size of the influence, E.S. Stephenson and his lodge was not so important. But if the aim is the understanding of the direction of Japanese people's hidden spirituality, his would be an interesting case of the meeting of spiritualities over the Pacific. As I said, the period from around 1910 to the middle of the 1920s saw an uprising of the spiritual thoughts and practices. So it seems natural that Stephenson started publishing theosophical works. In this part, we will see the biography of him and next his relationships with his contemporaries. Edward Stanley Stephenson was born in 1871 and died in 1926. Professor Stephenson was born in Bowden, Cheshire, England. His father was the head of a large importing firm with headquarters in Kobe, Japan. Young Stephenson came to America at the age of 18, spending the next 3 or 4 years in traveling in this country, visiting practically every section and mingling with all classes in an effort to find an explanation for what then seemed to him the unexplainable problem of life. Finally, when in San Francisco in the late 90s, he happened to hear of Theosophy and became acquainted with members of Theosophy there. He came to Japan in 1898 in order to help his father's firm. He resigned from it and began teaching at some English schools and working for Japan Times as a proofreader. After that, he got a teaching job at the Imperial Naval Engineering College, Yokosuka, which would last for 20 years, from 1902 to 1922. There is an interesting article which depicted Stephenson as a young man in his early days, probably one day in 1900 in Japan. The article was published in the Buddhist Journal, and the author was Sugimura Kotaro, later a famous journalist under the nom de plume of Sugimura Soyinkan. And Sugimura wrote of him as a merry young guy who was frank, always smiling and talking, and smoking incessantly. While talking with Sugimura, Stephenson claimed himself a Buddhist as he believed in karma and reincarnation. He told Sugimura that Jesus also taught the same doctrine as the Buddha. There was no distinction on the level of the basic doctrine between Christianity and Buddhism. However, when it comes to Buddhism today, he severely criticized Japanese Buddhism. Stephenson claimed, quote, "Buddhism died first in India and then in Korea, and now dying in Japan. True living Buddhism now remains only in the North America, namely the Theosophy of Blavatsky and Olcott. With the concentration of the will, they can do the miraculous things easily. They can lift themselves up in the air, go into the fire without being burned, and talk with the dead people as if they were living. Can Japanese Buddhists do this? Japanese Buddhists despised such phenomena only because they have lost the power," unquote. If Stephenson had criticized Japanese Buddhism for its irrational elements, Sugimura would have agreed with him. However, he praised the miraculous elements in Japanese Buddhism, which modern Buddhists like Sugimura try to extinguish. So Sugimura seems to have been indignant with Stephenson's Buddhism or Theosophy. Still, 13 years later, when he made a speech at Kyutsu Kyokai, Stephenson would stress the ethical elements of Theosophy. This change might be due to Catherine Tingley. Stephenson started his lodge activity in Zushi perhaps in 1910, because the translator of the key of Theosophy, Udaka Hiyosaku, was admitted into the Theosophical Society in January 1910. Udaka had studied at Stanford University and was teaching English at Zushi Kaisai Middle School. This lodge published the translation of J.H. Fassel's Incidents in the History of the Theosophical Movement, Theosophical Manuals, as well as The Key to Theosophy, which was published by a large publishing firm, Hakubunkan. Stephenson married Arai Mitsu, a Japanese woman of samurai family. They adopted a son, Tetsuo, and a daughter, Tamiko. He sent Tetsuo to Point Loma in 1909, and then Tamiko. Hirai Kinza, who had received his interest in Theosophy, came to know Stephenson and planned to send his younger daughter with Tamiko to Point Loma, but failed owing to his relatives' objections. In 1922, Stephenson resigned from the college and moved to Point Loma with his wife. His letter of resignation, dated April 15, 1922, said that, owing to urgent family reasons, he is going to resign at the end of the term, and that he would like to return to Japan again with his family in 1 or 2 years after staying at Point Loma. His wish was not realized. How far Stephenson had influences among Japanese intellectuals or elites is not clear, but some of them came to have favorable opinions about theosophy around 1910. One of the pro-theosophy intellectuals, Naruse Jinzo, was a pioneer of women's higher education and founded Japan's Women's University in 1900. He had been a Christian, but his religious faith might as well be called non-sectarian, spiritual, when he opened his university. His lectures after 1910 contained such esoteric terms like cosmic vibration, infinite spirit, astral light, and make stress on inner divinity. He spoke about the importance of atmosphere, using the pictures of aura in Ledbetter's book Thought Forms. Later, Naruse himself would visit Point Loma. Another important person is Shibusawa Eiichi. He was one of the most successful entrepreneurs in various types of businesses, so he is called father of Japanese capitalism. He was not only a capitalist, but also a sincere thinker of Confucianism. He wanted to make a modern economical ethics out of it. He resigned his post as administrator of companies in 1909 and began to devote himself to the improvement of social ethics or the problem of thoughts. In 1909, he traveled around America as a leader of a group of capitalists and industrialists. During this tour, the group visited the Raja Yoga Academy, although Shibusawa could not visit owing to his illness. Tingley made a welcome speech remembering her short stay in Japan in 1903 and praised its nationalistic control of thoughts. Quote, "There certainly was a wisdom among your people. There was a unity of purpose, a national intuition that protected you as a nation from a system of thought that now overshadows many countries." Unquote. And theosophy will make the good better. Quote, "I felt that someday, not far distant, the Japanese will be ready to receive with glad hearts the teachings of theosophy in its purity and simplicity. When this is done, then Japan will receive a new impulse, a new light, to make the home life even more sacred, and to make the Japanese nation a great power in the international life of the world." Unquote. These words might have something to do with Stephenson's lodge activity, which was accelerated the next year. Iwaya Sazanami, a famous novelist and a member of this tour, wrote of his impression he received on this day in one of the magazines. He praised the scenery of the education of Point Loma. He wrote about the eloquence of Catherine Tingley, the good behavior of Tetsuo Stephenson and other children at the academy. Nakajima Rikizo, a professor of ethics at the University of Tokyo, visited the Raja Yoga Academy after he heard a good opinion about the Raja Yoga Academy from someone in Shibusawa Eiki's tour. He admired the self-control of the children and found their similarities in the Japanese education. In 1912, Naruse Jinzo and Anesaki Masaharu and Shibusawa Eiki organized a new ethical society called the Association Concordia, which aimed at world peace as well as the dialogue and mutual understandings between various standpoints of religion and ethics. It is clear that this society is similar to the Theosophical Society in its ideals, but how extensive the influence was is not clear. Anyway, at one meeting of this society, E.S. Stephenson was invited to make a speech, which he did in December 1913. In this lecture, he spoke of the ideals of Theosophy, explaining the truth of the universal brotherhood idea and the Raja Yoga educational system. He said the education at the Raja Yoga Academy resembled that of Japan, especially the relationship between teachers and disciples. He quoted the words of Tingley about inner divinity and compared it to the theory of Confucianism, which Shibusawa thought most highly of. Stephenson was proud to say that by developing the inner self, or inner divinity, we can educate students better in personality, body, spirit, and knowledge. The Raja Yoga method is much better than Montessori, he said. After the lecture, Nakajima Rikizo praised Theosophy as it was like the education of samurai. He spoke highly of what he had seen at the Raja Yoga Academy the year before, saying the behaviors of the children there were calmer than those of other children. The Raja Yoga education seemed to Nakajima something like the education of samurai he had experienced when he was a child. In sum, Naruse praised the esoteric or inner side of Theosophy, while Nakajima the exoteric or outer side. Naruse saw a new educational system stressing the spontaneity of the Raja Yoga Academy, while Nakajima saw a traditional education stressing self-control. In the 1920s, a new educational system was in full bloom, but the Raja Yoga education idea did not have enough followers to continue it in Japan. Theosophy was based on the middle and upper class, while Omotokyo had first started as a small group of farmers in the countryside of Kyoto. So they didn't need to come across, but in the 1920s, Omotokyo began to have the converts among the naval officers and intellectuals. The early important convert was Imori Masayoshi. He was a naval ex-officer of engineering, but rather a kind of spiritual seeker. He came into contact with Stephenson after having gone through various spiritual teachings. He was so attracted to Theosophy that he thought of moving to Point Loma. But in 1915, just before he sailed to America, he met an ex-naval officer who had been converted to Omotokyo. His story of the experience in Omotokyo convinced Imori of its importance and authenticity, making him quit the plan and on the contrary move to Ayabe, Kyoto, where the headquarters of Omotokyo lies. Imori would soon be appointed a leader of its missionary body. He visited Yokosuka and converted Asano Wasaburo, who was a teacher of English at the Imperial Naval Engineering College and a Japanese friend of the Stephensons. In 1916, Asano got the training of Chinkon Kinshin Noho, and in 1917 he moved to Ayabe, where he would soon become one of Omotokyo's leading members. Asano was an important person to appeal to the middle class, as he was a prestigious graduate of the University of Tokyo and an ex-teacher of the Naval College. He himself had been familiar with theosophical teachings through Stephenson, but he came to believe in the miraculous things caused with the help of gods and spirits, using Chinkon Kinshin Noho of Omotokyo. Stephenson warned him not to believe Omotokyo, but in vain. Later, Asano left Omo Tokyo and started the Society of Spiritualism, into which spiritualism, theosophy, and Shintoism were mixed together. In the 1910s, theosophy seemed to some intellectuals an answer to the difficulties of education, religion, and social thought. Especially the problem of the relationship between education and religion came forward. To make the public educational system more moralistic, using religion is the easiest way, but religion and education had been cut apart by an instruction of the Ministry of Education issued in 1899. So Theosophy's spiritual but not religious teachings seemed of help to the improvement of Japanese education, especially in its moral aspects. Stephenson praised Confucianism as it resembled, so he thought, the theory of inner divinity, and Confucianism was a theoretical framework behind the Japanese traditional way of education. Tingley dreamt of Japan as a spiritual nation, but actually it wasn't. So elites of the association Concordia dreamt of improving and making more spiritual their public educational system bottom up. But the influence of those elites was very restricted. Then, did the theosophy Stephenson introduced come to nothing? The answer seems no. Some of theosophy's ideas, like aura, would be absorbed and mixed with Japanese religious ideas or practices by the people at Omo Tokyo, and the spiritual seekers like Asano Wasaburo or Masaharu, an ex-Omo Tokyo believer and the founder of Saicho Nii and Miurase Kizo, to make a new system of spiritual thoughts. Stevenson's name is almost forgotten, and his strategy to propagate theosophy failed. But theosophical ideas continued beneath the surface of the history in new religious movements until the 1970s. That's it.
Okay, thank you very much, Bianca. If there are questions about this presentation, I think the person who knows most about this is Ken Small. But we must be honest, I think for me it is a real new area, and I have not much knowledge about it, but maybe Ken has.
Maybe. Any questions? If there are no questions, it would be easy. Yes.
Suzuki also visit Point Loma himself?
Yes, I'll mention that on Saturday in my talk, so I'll save it for then, maybe. I'll say it again now. Okay, so Suzuki, a number of his things that are published in English are mentioned in this talk, starting, and of course Suzuki comes to America for the World Parliament of Religions in 1896, which is is it 96? Yes. Or 93. I'm sorry, 93. So, as the translator for the first Zen teacher to come to America. So and he's only, I think at that time, he's maybe 18 years old or something. So this is Suzuki's beginning, is very early. So then he, publishes the translation of Swedenborg, and then they begin also publishing the Eastern Buddhist magazine in 1922. And I think later, in the late 20s, his first book is published in English. And about that time, he's, I'll say this again on Saturday, but so then he's in touch with Crispus Humphreys and other people at that time. So at the same time, another Zen teacher has come to America, who is the student of Soyensaku the first Zen teacher who spoke at the parliament, and his name is Nyogen Senzaki. So Nyogen Senzaki first lived in the Bay Area and then in Los Angeles. So he was in Los Angeles in the mid-30s, and Suzuki had become known at Point Loma through his writings already, which you'll find referenced in this book. So this is, just as history, the first volume of the esoteric writings of Peruker. These were talks to Peruker's esoteric group in 1929, 30, 31. They were then put into book form. And there's a great deal of Mahayana Buddhism in that, in references to Suzuki's writings that are available at the time. So de Zirkov is looking, as one of the people who helped put this together with Helen Harris, with Peruker, is trying to find access to Suzuki. So he does that. He somehow, through someone, I don't know who it was in LA, he contacts Nyogen Senzaki. So Boris de Zirkov writes to Senzaki, who then is in touch with D.T. Suzuki, and that's how the invitation was made to Point Loma, which is quite interesting, really. And then D.T. Suzuki came to Point Loma on his trip to the US and to Europe in 1936 and spent a day at Point Loma at that time.
An American?
Beatrice Lane was, yes, American. They had met earlier, I think, the East Coast at Columbia University. She had become a member of the Adyar Society initially, and it was Beatrice Lane who introduced him early to Blavatsky's Voice of the Silence. That's how that first connection with Theosophy took place, with D.T. Suzuki.
It's a wonderful paper. Whoever wrote it, we don't have here at present, but I was impressed at the coverage of the history.
Yeah, the writer is Shinichi Yoshinaga. He's a professor in a university in Japan, and his main focus of interest is new religious movements in Japan and the relationship of Theosophy especially. He's written a number of papers and presentations, beginning with Olcott's work in Japan and D.T. Suzuki's influence and these interactions back and forth, and then also with this part on E.S. Stephenson. He said he will write more on Stephenson, but there's only small amounts of archival material available, and as he slowly has put this together, it's become more and more interesting. He felt he wrote this very quickly. He had several other papers to do this summer. He felt it was almost not adequate, but I think it was quite good. Yeah, so he'll have more on Stephenson at another time. He and his associate of his, that was his PhD professor, visited here in 2001, summer. I remember the date. So we had a really nice visit. At that time, they met both of my parents. We had a very nice interaction. They had also done some research at Pasadena, and then they came here, and I had, showed them some material from the early century path and some things that they had been unable to find. And that's what woke them up more to study Stephenson more. When Stephenson writes his letter of resignation leaving Japan, it's because of his own illness. That's what the family matter is. He doesn't explain there. And that's why he never returned. He was only maybe about 52 years old at that time. He died 4 years later at Point Loma, or 5 years later, something like that. Yeah.
Do you know if there is any theosophical activities right now in Japan? Through Shin'ichi, maybe?
I thought it was in the paper, no? There's an Adyar Lodge in at least one or two. I'm quite sure. Yeah. But they came into, they don't go back into the earlier history. It's only more recent, since post 1970. Again, also Shin'ichi studied, his main professor is Shizutaro Ueda. We wouldn't know that name here, but in Japan, there's what's called the Kyoto School. Kyoto School also stems out of, D.T. Suzuki is connected to it. A man named Nishida is considered the great modern philosopher of Japan. Nishida is, maybe next year I would do a paper. It's not easy. Nishida is very important because, and Shinichi Yoshinaga's teacher is the current kind of main person of that school, Ueda. So I would consider personally, in the broad sense, that an extraordinarily theosophical school of thought, trying to integrate essentially the core concepts of Mahayana Buddhism with Western philosophy. So Nishida draws strongly, of course, from the usual Western philosophers, but then he frequently would draw on people like Meister Eckhart or Jakob Burma, as well as from the other direction, Nagarjuna and deep Mahayana philosophy. So he's coming out of that kind of thinking and perspective.
Some other questions? No? Okay. Then we go over to our